Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's hearing. We're going to continue this morning with the evidence of Dr. Lane.
Yes.
So could you ask Dr. Lane to come back in, please? Thank you. All right, ready to carry on?
Yep.
Good, thank you very much. Yes, Miss Grange.
Yes, thank you. So just to signpost what we're going to be dealing with today, I want to focus today on the active and passive fire safety measures inside the building and the extent to which they failed to control the spread of fire and smoke and contributed to the speed at which the fire spread. And in general, we're going to be looking at the certain passive measures first, including the flat and stair doors, and then looking at the active systems later in the day, including the fire main, the lift and the smoke control system. Mr. Chairman, I want to just give a very minor trigger warning at this stage on the basis that during the next two sections dealing with doors, we will look at some images of fire doors in Grenfell Tower, including some images of the doors when tested with smoke and flame around them. So it's just a minor trigger warning now in case anyone would find those images distressing. And before we start, I understand, Dr. Lane, that there is one point of clarification that you would like to provide in relation to your evidence from last Thursday.
Yes, there is. I think it was just before lunch there was quite a rapid series of questions about non-combustible, combustible and flammability.
Yeah.
So I just want to speak very briefly about that. The question about non-combustible was did I agree it dealt with calorific content only? My answer is no, because sustained flaming, mass loss and temperature difference must also be measured, and within limits that's what becomes the definition of a non-combustible material. The word flammability threw me because it's not a defined term in reaction to fire tests, or in general it's a word I won't use as a fire safety engineer. I think if the person meant sustained flaming, if sustained flaming is part of assessing combustible and non-combustible materials, the answer is yes, with 0 required for a non-combustible material, and then different quantities of sustained flaming. Remember we talked about the B down to F then for other materials. Yeah. So it's a very technical point, but I just felt quite bad I didn't answer it on Thursday.
Thank you.
Well, that's helpful. Thank you very much.
Right, thank you.
Thank you. Yes, so just before we consider flat doors specifically, I just want to start by considering the overall consequences once we have a multi-storey fire in existence. Now, once that was the case, so we have this external fire spread, what fire safety features of the building do you think became most critical inside the building?
Okay, so I haven't given an order of contribution yet, as you know. So I wouldn't mind actually talking about that for just a little while. So once the cladding fire had become a multi-storey fire, then over time internal fires also commenced, and so we now over time had a multi-storey internal fire condition. So it's two multi-storey events, if you will, one caused by the other. And I also made clear on Thursday that in the next phase of my work I'm going to be looking at intrinsic risk and risk assessments. And this is important because a non-compliant system will either play a role or not in terms of a hazard posed to an individual or a grouping of individuals as a function of the fire hazard in that location. So giving a theoretical example, a non-compliant fire door may have a substantial contribution to the severe consequences in one location for a grouping of people, and it may have had no contribution in another location where the consequences were not extreme. So the non-compliant status is important, and we'll be talking a lot about that today, and in terms of health and safety duties. But the next thing then is the overall assessment of risk, understanding the hazards to the people who lost their lives, particularly in those locations, and how each active and passive fire safety measure contributed to what's called severe harm. And I've put in section 2 of my report a document I wanted to make you aware of. It's called PASS 79. And that sets out a fire risk assessment methodology. And risk is a function of probability of occurrence and consequences of failure. And where there's multiple loss of life, that's defined as severe harm. So we know the consequences and we know the probability. And the next step then is to analyse for each grouping of people who lost their lives, how each one of the active and passive measures contributed. So I can't pick one more than the other for all conditions, because the fire hazard is different as a function of one's location.
Yep.
Just in terms of kind of particular features that are critical, would you agree that the protected stairs in the lobbies are two particularly important spaces?
Yes, so in Grenfell Tower, there was only one staircase, and when a resident was in a flat, one lobby leading to one staircase. And so once the fire had spread through the cladding on multiple floors, there was only one way to leave the building. And so the staircase, but particularly the lobby, immediately became the most important protection measure for those persons when they were evacuating. For people who stayed, various active and passive fire protection measures were needed or relied upon by them to make that staying put safe in that context. Okay, so the stairs and the lobby became very important, but the compartmentation to the flats was exceptionally important for people who did not walk down the stairs of their own accord within particularly the first 40 minutes. And I've gone into considerable detail on this subject in section 14 particularly.
I just wanted to give it, or get you to give the chance to give an overview at this stage.
Yes.
So, and what you're saying there is that flat doors and stair doors, which we're going to come to in a moment, become particularly important.
They become particularly important, but there are other openings in the lobby that are potential for fire and smoke spread. So any riser breaking through the lobby, such as the smoke control riser when it's shut, must also prevent fire and smoke spread. There was multiple other services in the lobby built as part of the primary refurbishment, and they too needed to prevent fire and smoke spread. But in terms of the immediate line between a person in a flat and the conditions in the lobby and the conditions in the stairs, the doors are particularly important in my opinion.
Yeah. And just one more question before we get specifically to flat doors. In terms of the active and passive safety systems in the building, I think your evidence is that the greater number of layers of safety which fail, the greater the likelihood of a major incident. Is that correct? Yes,
that's correct. And that's not, let's say, an opinion I formulated on my own. It's kind of classic disaster or catastrophe theory, where the more layers, just as the statutory guidance builds in layers and multiple layers. We spoke a lot about cavity barriers on Thursday. There's at least 3, for example, between one window and the next. So the more layers that are defective or entirely defective, the higher the risk and the more severe the consequences.
Yeah. So turning then to specifically look at flat doors, it's really chapter 15 and it's particularly chapter 15.5 and appendix I that are going to be relevant here if you want to make sure you've got those to hand. And picking up on that theme about flat doors and their importance, in the LGA guide on purpose-built blocks of flats, it says that flat doors are critical to the safety of the common parts. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I do.
In terms of the relevant legal framework and what happened at Grenfell Tower, we know that there was a significant flat door replacement in 2011 in Grenfell Tower. At that time, 106 flat doors were replaced. You give the figures in your report. That's 58 unglazed flat doors and 48 glazed. And both types of door were master door, shore door doors.
That's correct.
Is that correct? And in addition, there were 14 doors that were not replaced at that time, which you believe may have been 12 leaseholder doors and 2 tenanted doors. Is that correct?
Yes.
We should perhaps note at this point that you've noted that in certain chronologies produced in the inquiry that there's some reference to flat door replacement works in or about 1985, but is it right that we don't have any documentation at this stage to assist us in what would have been the scope of those works?
That's correct.
Now, as we've already discussed back last Thursday, your view is that Grenfell Tower was originally constructed in accordance with the guidance set out in CP3 1971, and you've explained to us what the CP3 1971 guidance would have been for doors. You've said the recommended performance specification was for something called a Type 3 fire-resisting door.
Yes.
Is that correct?
Yes.
And you've explained in your report that that meant they must have freedom from collapse for at least 30 minutes and resistance to passage of flame for at least 20 minutes and fitted with automatic self-closing devices. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Yeah. Now, building up towards the 2011 flat door replacement, you note that there was some DCLG guidance in 2006, fire safety risk assessment sleeping accommodation, often referred to as the DCLG sleeping guide.
Yes.
That was available and in force at the time the 2011 door replacement was being considered. Is that correct?
Yes.
And you say that that assisted in any risk assessment relating to doors. Is that correct?
It should do.
And you say that a key point that is made in that DCLG guidance was that all doors onto a protected corridor should have a self-closing device. Is that correct?
Yes.
And you also note that from July 2011, there was the Local Government Association LGA guide on purpose-built blocks of flats.
Correct.
Which also applied to doors in Grenfell Tower. Is that correct?
Correct.
And is it right that this represents guidance to assist responsible persons to discharge their duties under the Fire Safety Order 2005?
Yes, it is.
I just want to look at a few potentially relevant parts of that guidance.
Okay.
So if we can pull that up, if we can go to CTAR 5033 at page 98. This is internal page 95 of the LGA guide. And if we can just, if we could blow up that table at the bottom. That's great. Can you see that? Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Actually, it's probably worth saying nothing has been made available to me, and I would have thought it should have been by now, as to what the performance spec for those works actually were, and so what document was actually relied upon or considered.
Right.
Yeah, that's helpful. What I'm going to do is look at the LGA guide now, and then we'll look at ADB, the relevant parts of ADB, which you've summarised. So just sticking with this, the LGA guide, this is giving benchmarks for existing blocks of flats.
Yes.
And what it's saying is if you've got different travel distances, you may be advised to do different things with your doors. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And at Grenfell Tower, we'll come back to your diagram in a moment. You've measured travel distance in the lobby as up to 10.5 metres.
Yes.
Which means that, are we on the second to last bullet point here?
Exactly. So if one agrees with the LGA guide, it says that for a travel distance between 10 to 15 metres, in an existing building, you know, as a minimum, the existing doors should be upgraded as opposed to being replaced with a new door.
Yeah. So just to read that, in ventilated lobbies and corridors, travel distances of 10 to 15 metres may be acceptable, providing all doors to the common corridor or lobby are at least upgraded FD30S doors. And the smoke ventilation comprises PVs or AOVs.
That's correct. So it's travel distance and ventilation provision.
Yeah, just to be clear what PV or AOV means. Is that
a permanent vent and an automatically openable vent.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks. If we can then stay with this LGA guide for a moment and go to paragraph 62.17, that's on internal page 101. If we can highlight.
Yeah.
So here, what it's saying is it's not going to be practicable to test existing doors to confirm their actual fire resistance. Therefore, various options exist in relation to doors.
Yes.
And so this is saying you can either accept the door as it is, upgrade the door, or replace the door. Is that correct?
Well, it's the view of this guide that it's not practicable to test existing doors. And so it offers you some other approaches to consider.
Yeah.
And
one of those is replacement of the door.
It is indeed, yes.
Exactly. It might be helpful at this point, because this is going to come up in relation to doors generally. Where we've got upgrading of the door, it talks about fitting intermittent strips and smoke seals. Could you just explain to the chairman what the difference is between an intermittent strip and a smoke seal?
Yes, I can. So an intermittent strip operates under heat, and it's intended to prevent the passage of flame as well as the gaseous products of combustion. A smoke seal is intended to prevent the passage of gaseous products of combustion only, and it's also called a cold smoke seal.
Yeah, that's helpful. Again, just sticking with this guide for the moment, can we go to page 102 and look at 6220? So is it right that that is making clear the fitting of suitable self-closing devices, whether to replace rising butt hinges or because the doors are not fitted with self-closing devices, must be undertaken in the short term as a matter of priority? So in this guide, it is very clear that you must fit self-closing devices as a priority. Is that correct?
Absolutely, which aligns with the statutory guidance.
Yes.
Yeah.
Which we're going to come to next. And then can we also look at paragraph 62.22 of the LGA guide? That's at the bottom of there. And is it right that that makes clear that any new or replacement doors within an existing block of flats should meet current standards for fire-resisting doors? So if you choose to put in a new door, you need to put it in accordance with current standards.
Yeah, that's correct. And so one would be expected to have the relevant test evidence to either the national class or the European class.
Thank you. Now, just before we come on to approved document B, we talked about travel distances and your assessment of travel distances. If we go to, you've put a very clear figure in your addendum to your report. That's BLAS 5037 on page 24, figure 15.5. We could bring that up. No, it's not that, sorry. It's BLAS 5037 on page 24. No, it's not that either. Sorry, do you want to take that down? So it's within that same addendum, and it's figure 15.5. getting the page number for it.
Do you want me to just speak anyway? I'm not sure the figure can really do
Fine, if you just
All
want
right,
to explain.
as powerful as it might be
You,
looking
you
at the
tell us
moment.
what.
Yeah, so I think on the drawing I marked up the travel distance from each door.
Yeah.
And it's quite striking actually when you think about consequences later, the difference in terms of journey distance as a function of what flat you lived in. And in terms of the LGA guide, that the travel distances are exceeded. I don't know if you wanted to cover anything.
We'll come back
else.
to that. We can come back to that in a bit. We'll check we've got the right diagram. That's fine.
So, for example, flat
it's page
ones,
25.
the travel distance is only 4.5 metres. It's a very short distance. But for other flats, it's in excess of 10 metres. And that's why this situation about the hazard experienced in specific locations is going to become so important.
Yeah, that's it. If we can zoom in on that middle figure, blow that up.
Yeah.
So does that illustrate your
Yes.
travel distances?
Yeah. So you can see flat 4, occupants of flat 4, have to travel, over double that of, say, somebody living in flat 1.
Yeah. I now want to go to your summary of the requirements of approved document B, the relevant part of approved document B, and this is in table I3 of your report. If we could bring that up on the screen, that's BLAS 5030 at 36. Thank you. And you've explained in your report that at the time of the flat door replacement work in 2011, approved document B 2010 would have been in place. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And what you've sought to do in this table, which I think appears in A3 landscape in your report,
Yes.
is to summarise the key performance requirements that are there in approved document B 2010. Is that correct?
That's correct.
I just want to pick out some of the key ones at this stage. So if we go the fourth column along, you've got fire resistance, and there you've got no integrity failure up to 30 minutes when tested to the relevant British standards. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So that's 30 minutes integrity.
30-minute door,
And
yes.
just remind us what integrity is.
It's a measure of preventing flame and temperature coming through cracks. That's a very simplistic definition. There are certain ways of measuring it during the test.
Yeah.
But it's basically to stop, to make sure there's no cracks and no flames protruding.
Yes. In the next column, you've got smoke leakage performance standard,
Yeah.
and you refer to they have to have a leakage rate not exceeding 3 cubic metres per metre per hour
Yes.
when tested in certain ways. Is that
Yes,
correct?
that's correct. And measuring that leakage is deemed to represent the smoke leakage condition.
Yeah. Two other points on this table. Glazing in your next column, in the sixth column, it makes it clear no glazing unless the glazing has, as per table A4, has been demonstrated to achieve an insulation performance equivalent to the required integrity performance. Is that correct?
That's
so it's saying your glazing's not got to be a weak point. Is that correct?
That's
It's
correct.
got
So
to-
on escape routes, the glazing basically has to be detailed up to be to not be a weak spot and not allow heat transfer through the glass. So insulation performance is about detailing to prevent temperature rise on the unheated side. So it's protecting the person walking past the closed door if the fire is behind that door.
And then the point you made earlier about self-closing device is in the very next column, self-closer performance standard. So that makes it clear that it is required under Approved Document B 2010. It must close the door from any angle and against any latch.
Yes.
Is that correct?
That's
so
correct.
That's what you were emphasising earlier, that this statutory guidance, the LGA guide,
Exactly.
the DCLG sleeping guide, they are all clear about self-closing devices.
They're all entirely aligned about the provision of self-closers. And the guidance since the 70s has been very clear about what the role of a self-closer is and why it is so important.
Yeah. Do you want to just explain why it's so important? I mean, it may sound obvious,
I feel to shut the door,
Yeah.
to shut the door after a person, to make sure the door can close.
Yeah.
I
now want to
I can't say anything else.
Yeah.
To make sure it does close.
Yeah,
really.
to make sure. Did I say
Yeah.
sure it doesn't close?
No, you
to
said
make sure
can,
it does
but-
close. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Now, I now want to run through your conclusions about the performance of the flat doors based on your investigations.
Yeah.
And primarily we're looking at the 106 master doors
Yes.
that were replaced. And you say in your report that you surveyed 8 of these master doors during your site visits. Is that correct?
Yes.
And you've noted a large number of problems with these doors.
Yeah.
I just want to pick up on some of the key ones. There's a lot of detail in Appendix I,
Yeah.
but I want to focus on some of the key points you seem to be making. You say that the 106 doors were not tested for 30 minutes integrity from both sides of the door and therefore were not compliant with the requirements of Approved Document B. Is that correct?
Yeah. So there's the door installed in Grenfell Tower, and then there's the door that was tested and used as the relevant test evidence. So the test door was tested from one side only. But as you know, the test door type isn't what was installed at Grenfell Tower.
I understand.
Okay, so the door was tested from one side only.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's worthwhile, I think, at this point, noting that you have referred to the BRE global test report that the MPS obtained on one of these doors.
Yes.
They tested one of these doors on the 13th of February 2018 for fire integrity,
Yes.
and the door achieved just 15 minutes integrity. Is that correct?
That's correct, and with the glazing panel.
Yes,
in it.
I'd like to
Yeah.
just look at that test report because I think that's just
okay.
useful. So if we can bring that up, there we go. This is the test report, MET 000199996. And if we go to internal page 25 of this test report, if you can perhaps zoom in on that image. And here we have the door, and it says in the label, exposed face of specimen at time of first integrity failure, 15 minutes. And can you just talk us through what we're seeing in that picture?
Well, I mean, it's a bit blurry. I don't know how other... So what I see is flame coming out, presumably, where the glazing, glazed area is in that door.
Yeah.
And that's...
Mm-hmm.
around here.
Yeah.
And is it potentially significant that we're also seeing smoke coming from the sides of the door?
Yeah, so that's a bit complicated, actually, because if that smoke isn't hot enough, by definition in the test, it doesn't matter that smoke is coming around the door. And I have to be honest that that just I also witnessed some other doors being tested, and it really struck me during those tests that was deemed to be acceptable.
If we then go just one page on, page 26, that is the door at 28 minutes, is that right, at the end of the test?
Yes.
I just wanted to kind of
Yes.
so we can see the difference between
So
those
total
two.
failure of the door.
Yeah. Now, you note that this is a retrospective test of a door taken from Grenfell Tower.
Yes.
And it's obviously a glazed specimen that we're looking at here.
Yes.
in those circumstances, how representative do you think this test result to be of the likely doors' performance, of those doors' performance?
I think it was nearly half the doors had glazing in them.
Yeah.
Yes.
And where there's where there's a glazed door, you consider this test evidence to be relevant?
Yes. Well, my understanding is this is the door that was installed at Grenfell Tower, but you know, the BRE and the police would need to just confirm all of that. But my understanding is that is one of the doors, and so it is representative.
Yes. Now, on glazing, that's another one of the issues you've identified in your report. You've noticed that the glazed test specimen used for the original fire test report in support of those flat doors used a different specification of glass to that which was actually used in a 2011 upgrade. Is that correct?
That's correct. They're not described the same way, and obviously, if we wanted to pursue that further, it would be useful to understand exactly what the exact technical specification that was proposed and what was installed in the tower. But I personally don't need that level of detail because I'm clear the door failed in the test.
Yeah. And you say for that reason that test evidence that came with the doors is not relevant test evidence in circumstances where the glazing is different.
Exactly, because it's made very clear in the statutory guidance document the importance of taking care with the glass. And so when one is offering a door with glazing for installation in a residential building, it's important to make sure that glazed element is a glazed element that's been tested satisfactorily and will allow the door to perform to the required standard.
Yeah. Now, you've also concluded that the flat doors don't comply with certain cold smoke leakage requirements in ADB Table B1. What you've said is there's no information in the test report about cold smoke leakage performance.
Yeah, exactly. So there's 2 points here. So there is no, in terms of works, there's no technical specification for the work. So I don't know who asked for what type of door. So I have to rely on a spreadsheet from Masterdoor, and they are for FD30 doors with no S stated. And the test report I have is also FD30 with no S test done. So you could say they match, but I don't understand why an FD30 door was installed when an FD30S door should have been installed. Yeah. So it's 2 separate points. S doesn't appear to have been called for, and S was not provided.
And S is about cold smoke leakage.
Yes, it is. It's about
can you just explain to us what cold smoke leakage is referring to in simple terms?
So the door in its final form, with any fixtures and fittings, any intumescence, anything at all needed for fire resistance, is put under pressure and the leakage measured. It has to be lower than a defined value, and that represents what the door would do when smoke is attempting to pass through it.
Now, you've also concluded that the doors contain different hardware, including locks, hinges, letter plates, letter boxes, than in the test reports. Is that correct? Can you explain why that's potentially so significant, different hardware in doors?
Well, the statutory guidance document, approved document B, makes that clear, and the test reports for fire doors makes that clear. And it seems to be because, if you want to use the phrase, getting the door through the test, it's a sensitive business. So any piece of metal, any gap, so locks, letter boxes, may act as a heat transfer route, as a flame spread route, or a hot smoke spread route, and so would cause the door to fail. So a door, when sold, can be detailed up to perform perfectly satisfactorily, but then it must be installed that way too because of those sensitivities. And I consider those sensitivities to be very well documented as an issue.
Now, in terms of intumescent seals, in your report, you've compared the intumescent seals that were specified for the 109 replacement doors with those included in the test specimens.
Yes.
And again, you found that none were specified with the same intumescent seals as the test report.
So the seal near the locks, some of the seals near the locks and the hinges were, but the main seals around the leaf were not. So the majority of the seals were not as communicated in the test report provided as being relevant.
And then in terms of self-closing mechanisms,
Yeah.
you've noted that the door closers which were specified for the refurbishment were not the same as the door closer in the one specimen that was tested. Is that correct?
That is correct. It was an overhead closer, that classic arm closer in the test. And most of the doors I saw had that internal closing device using the chain. But you'll see in the detail in my report, for example, there's photos from London Fire Brigade after the fire where they did observe one door with an overhead closing device. But I don't know why that was there, because it was the chain closing mechanism appears to have been the one specified during the door replacement works.
Now, you've highlighted in your report several instances of door closers malfunctioning or breaking based on the written evidence you've seen.
Yeah.
Do you agree that we've heard more examples of that in the oral evidence from the
Yes, I do.
BSRs during the course of the BSR's evidence? And you've also noted, in terms of frequency of inspections, you note in your report that the LGA guide suggests 6 monthly inspections and preventative maintenance for fire-resisting doors.
That's correct.
Aimed at identifying defects such as missing or ineffective closing devices. Is that correct?
That's correct.
You also note that there's a relevant British standard, BS 8412/2008, which recommended 6 monthly checks of the door closers. Yeah. And you also say the DCLG guidance suggested more frequently, perhaps monthly checks.
Yeah, I think they're more making sure. I would consider that when you're doing a monthly inspection, if the door is able to close, and the 6 monthly inspection would be a careful review of the door.
Yeah. And you've noted that the TMO policy was for fire risk assessments on an annual or 2 yearly basis. Is that correct?
Apparently so.
Yeah. So if that, and we'll have to look at the evidence on this in phase two. If that was the only time the door closers were checked, for example, hypothetically, if that was the only time they were checked, what you're drawing attention to is that there's other guidance that suggests more frequent inspections.
Yeah. So I haven't dealt with maintenance yet.
Yes.
So yes, the frequency seems to be different. But in phase two, I'd be more interested in the quality of the inspection and the maintenance that occurred in the tower.
Now, before we come on to the impact of these issues on the events of the night, just on the 14 doors that were not replaced in 2011, that's 12 leaseholder doors and 2 tenanted doors. You say in your report you can't confirm the specification of the original 1970s installation or any subsequent replacement of the doors because they've now been lost in the fire. Is that correct?
Yeah, so I couldn't inspect the doors because they're all gone. Yeah. And no relevant paperwork has been made available to me about them. The only thing I know is what the risk assessor said to the TMO, which is in my report, and he considered those doors to be fire retardant, which isn't a relevant term regarding fire resisting doors.
You've said in your report that the compliance of these doors cannot be determined at this time, and that because the doors have been lost, their compliance will not be able to be determined. Is that your position?
Unless the TMO or other parties produce the paperwork and information they relied upon when they decided the performance of those doors.
So I now want to look at the impact of those issues that you've identified on the events of the night. And you summarise the potential contribution that these issues may have caused in your report at paragraph 19.5.28. Can we just go to that? That's BLAS 5019 at page 20. And so you've crystallised for us here what you say are a number of ways in which the flat entrance doors fail to control the spread of smoke and fire to the lobbies in these paragraphs. I just want to take you through them and just summarise.
Okay.
So you say in A, failure to prevent the spread of smoke and flame by leakage through gaps between the door leaf and the door frame. Is that correct?
That's correct, yeah. And that's important in the early stages of a fire.
Yeah.
Or if one is waiting some time in a flat remote from a hazard and smoke is spreading from the lobby.
Yeah. In B, what you're drawing attention to there, I think, is failure to resist the spread of fire and smoke from within an apartment due to multiple untested components in the door.
Yes.
So that would include hardware, glazing, etc.
Yes.
Is that correct?
That's correct. So once a severe fire happened near a door, or there was a flashover in an apartment, or any kind of localised heating condition, failure of the door would be expected in theory, and obviously it's supported by witness evidence.
At C, you've got failure to resist the spread of smoke and fire from flashover within flats due to the presence of glazing expected, you say, to cause early failure based on the test evidence.
Yeah.
D, we have a failure of an unknown number of doors to self-close after an occupant's escape.
That's
Is that correct?
Yeah.
And you also say in the next paragraph, if we could go to the next page at the top of your report, that the fire doors failed in a second way, which is they failed to resist the spread of smoke and fire from the lobby, given that they're supposed to perform in both directions.
That's correct.
The key point you're making there?
Again, I'm back to this issue of what is the hazard in a specific location and at a specific time. That's very important. So in the event that one was in a flat with no fire within it, it may be there was a hazard in the lobby that you required protection from.
Yeah. Do you have a current view as to which of those are potentially the most significant on the night?
I want to look at the hazard in a specific location before I give a final opinion. I do consider the fire doors to be a very significant fire safety measure in general, and I think therefore their contribution to the events on the night require very careful review.
Yeah. What would you say to the point which can be made that the doors, even if compliant, would have only had 30 minutes integrity?
That's correct. Yep, that's so it's not 60 minutes, it's not 120 minutes, it is 30 minutes.
And given that such doors are not intended to provide indefinite protection, isn't it inevitable that they're going to fail at some point?
It is indeed inevitable that they're going to fail at some point, but the important point is what happens before that failure occurs.
Yeah.
So I don't think it's acceptable to have, to consider, because they might fail anyway, it doesn't really matter what happens in the time period before that. I think that's very important, particularly for people who are waiting in flats.
I've been asked to put to you the following proposition. To the extent that the flat entrance doors were non-compliant, that had at most only a limited effect on the spread of fire and smoke and the outcome of the fire. Would you
I
agree
don't
with
agree
that?
with that at all.
Do you agree that there...
Well, would you like to explain why?
I think that those fire doors were needed for so many different reasons, as a function of where one was living, or waiting for rescue in the tower. So we have conditions where, protection from fire or protection from smoke, either in one's own apartment, in a lobby, and say from another flat on the floor. So wherever you're located, there may be nearby fire or remote fire, and you are relying on those lines to prevent those products eventually reaching your location. And I'm not avoiding the answer. That's why I've emphasised at the start today, the location of the flat and the location of the person is so important in terms of what that fire protection measure was needed for. And doors protect against fire and smoke, and so I will give a view therefore on how those doors performed in the lobbies, for the flats, when I carry out my risk assessment in phase 2.
Yeah.
Okay,
Right.
so it's not appropriate therefore either to simply say they all failed, they all have the same contribution. It's relevant to location and the hazard they were required to protect a person from.
Yes. So will it be relevant to your analysis at phase 2 that we can see examples from the BSR's evidence, some residents where they are talking about smoke coming in through the front door, whether underneath the bottom, around the sides, a couple of examples, clear examples through the letterbox?
That's correct.
Those are all areas you're interested in, is
I'm
that
very
correct?
interested in those areas.
Yeah. And one can give a number. I'm not going to go through them all now. There are a number of examples from the BSR's oral evidence.
Yes, there are, and that's why, again, I don't want to give any kind of overall opinion on one measure. I think there's a really important piece of analysis per flat, per lobby required to give a fair view on what those systems did.
Because would you accept that there are some examples of flat doors appearing to fare well on the night? For example, Antonio Roncolata, who's there for a very long time, I think he's the last person rescued.
Well, I think that's a really good example, actually. So the hazard in that flat was entirely different to, example, flat 1 up at level 23. So when I'm looking at the doors in that context, I will explain the hazard in that flat and why it was so different to the hazard in, for example, flat 1 at level 23, and so explain the relevance of the non-compliant fire doors.
Does it often come down to a matter of timing in terms of, as you said before, people staying in their flats and waiting in accordance with the stay put instruction, and the length of time that door is protecting them from hazards?
I wouldn't want to, that's quite a general question, and I would not want to answer it generally. I don't think it would be appropriate. It's all about specific hazards and specific protection needed.
Would it be possible to estimate how much smoke might seep out from a representative closed non-compliant door as compared with a compliant door? Yeah. Would it be possible to do that exercise?
I'm sure there's somebody clever somewhere can run a CFD analysis and work that out, if it was important.
Do you think that exercise would be a useful one to carry
At the
out?
moment, I don't have any plans to do that, but I'll let you know if I change my mind in phase 2.
And I think you've answered this, but in terms of doing a flat-by-flat analysis of the impact, for example, of no self-closing device or an inadequate self-closing device,
yes,
whether the door nevertheless shut or was shut behind, is that the kind of analysis you're flagging for phase 2? Would you agree that the presence of smoke in the lobbies is most likely to have been caused by a combination of factors, which may have also included flat entrance doors being held open or propped open, flat entrance doors being broken down by firefighters to fight fires? Would you agree that all of those factors are going to be relevant in terms of the presence of smoke on lobbies?
Though all those factors will be relevant, but I don't think we should overstate those other features in terms of quantity of location that actually occurred. So there's saying the fire brigade broke down doors, it sounds as if that was happening. I think it's a bit of a sweeping statement, isn't it? So there's very specific activity on specific floors, and I will look at the doors carefully in that regard. And in terms of smoke in the lobby, I've made clear there are other, and there may be more contributory features also, and I will take each measure in turn.
Just in terms of the early presence of smoke on the lobbies, some firefighters say they were very surprised to find smoke in lobbies at a very early stage in the fire. We get the evidence of, for example, Badillo, who's going up, and firefighter Secret similarly. Do you have any view at this stage about what factors might have been important in terms of explaining that early presence of smoke in some lobbies, or would you give the same answer?
Well, again, I want to do the location by location review, but there was a trend in terms of the location of the external flame front and the progression of early smoke in the lobbies. So clearly there was a smoke spread route from the cladding fire out to the lobby.
And will part of your analysis look at the flat sixes and any specific importance of the flat sixes and their self-closing device or their door in the fire?
Yeah, because remember, the whole point about having a self-closer is that when a person evacuates, they don't cause harm. I don't like to, that's not a nice way of putting it, but the whole point of having a self-closer is the door closes behind the person who's evacuated, and therefore the protection is maintained. That's why they're so incredibly important.
I'm now going to turn to a different but related topic of the stair doors.
Yeah.
For this purpose, it's really chapter 16 and appendices I and little bit of M, but mainly I, that is relevant. You want to make sure you've got those to hand.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
Now, turning to the stair doors, therefore, in your revised report, you've done a considerable amount of work to try and ascertain the history of the stair doors at Grenfell Tower, including whether they were compliant with relevant standards over time, including looking at their original installation at Grenfell Tower. Is that correct?
Yeah, so I just probably wouldn't mind being able to say that I have been contented since I wrote my report about the CP3 requirements for stair doors, but I know that other people had a lot of concern with my view, so that's why I did that extra work to try and explain with a lot of detail the performance of historic fire doors. And I've done that work, but my position remains about the CP3 requirements for those doors, because doors and ventilation together protect a lobby and protect the stair.
Now, prior to asking you some more detailed questions about that and about the stair doors in detail, can we just look at your conclusion at paragraph 19.7.27 of your report, BLAS 5019, at page 45. Could I just ask you to read that paragraph to yourself for a moment?
So this is the failure to prevent smoke spread.
Into the stairs, is that correct?
The stair. Yeah, the stair doors appear to be the primary route of spread of smoke and heat to the stair, because I didn't find any other opening.
Yeah.
No other significant failures in the construction separating the stair from the lobby or flats has been observed.
Yeah, and then is the next, I wanted to focus on the next stage. You say at this stage, the stair doors being opened or held open by either firefighting equipment or other objects appears to be the primary failure.
Yes, that's correct, because I didn't observe on site, I didn't observe in the tower, apologies, severe damage to the concrete in the staircase.
Yes.
And I would expect to see severe damage in the staircase, for example, if the door had entirely failed, so collapsed, collapsed on some form. I haven't seen that, so I can't say they failed that way. So I have to assume, therefore, that any heating effects I observed in the staircase or the smoke observed in the staircase came through the activity of the doors.
Yeah. And would you agree that we need to bear that in mind when it comes to any potential problems in terms of the performance of these stair doors? Your conclusion
I don't know
there,
what you mean.
that you're saying you think the primary failure appears to have been open doors. Do we need to bear that in mind when we then come and look at your detailed analysis?
I think I've been quite clear on that, yes. Yeah.
Just in general, can you explain the importance of stair doors in a building like Grenfell Tower with a single staircase?
Yeah, so they have two roles. To prevent smoke from the fire flat, which may have entered the lobby, entering the staircase, and so preventing escape from above the fire. And the second role is, and that's why it's to a higher standard actually, is again to prevent smoke entering the staircase, to protect firefighters who are moving up and down in that staircase carrying out their various duties.
Yeah. So as you say, because of that dual role, it has a particularly protected status, that staircase.
Yes, it does, yeah.
And does that make it all the more important as a safety feature?
All the more important. I think it's important. Yes, I think it's important. I'm probably not ready to say all the more important about anything just yet.
Yeah. Now I'm about to go to a more detailed passage. I'm happy to stop now or carry on in terms of a break. I'm in
Take a break at this point.
I'm okay, but how much would it be? Another 3 hours if we don't have a break?
Oh,
or
it could easily be.
20 minutes.
I would suggest we have a break now.
Okay.
And maybe have another one in about an hour's time.
Yes,
okay,
fine.
perfect.
So
yeah.
you go with the usher. No,
Okay,
don't talk
thank
to
you.
anyone about your evidence when you're out of the room,
Thank you
please.
very much.
And we'll come back at 11:05. All right, 11:05, please. All right, happy to go on?
Yep.
Yes, Ms. Grange?
Yes, thank you. I just have a small correction to make to the transcript and an apology. So at page 36 of the transcript, I'm recorded as saying that Antonio Roncolato was the last person to be rescued. In fact, that's not correct. It was Elpidio Bonifacio from flat 83. He was the last person rescued, and I ought to correct that and apologise. Thank you.
Thank you, thank you.
So, in terms of the stair doors,
Yep.
you have concluded that all 20 doors on levels 4 to 23 are original 1972 construction doors. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Can we just look at a couple of pictures of those doors just to remind ourselves what they looked like? You've got two pictures that are helpful in your report. BLAS 5030 at page 78, figure I25. If we can zoom in on that. So this is a level 6 stair door, is that correct?
Yes, it is.
And if we can look at the figure at the bottom, figure I26, we're going to come back to this picture and look in a moment, but there we see what the edge looks like of those doors. You say brush seal present. I'm not going to ask you questions about that right now, but this is just to remind ourselves what those doors look like. So that's the door on level 6. Can we also look at the level 19 stair door? That's BLAS 5030 at page 82, figure I30. So this is the level 19 stair door after the fire.
Yeah.
And again, so we can see the single vision panel, the same as we saw on level 6.
Yeah.
And you've drawn attention to the rail. Is that a kind of horizontal
exactly.
supporting?
Yes.
The style, is that a kind of vertical?
Yes.
And then we can also see a little bit of what the edge looked like.
Yeah.
So that's the level 19 stair door. Now,
And
as we've discussed previously...
Just also actually, because of what you asked me earlier, if you just have a look around the door on the concrete, you can't see any spalling effects, but you can see the significant charring of the stair door. You were asking me earlier about why I had chosen opening rather than a total failure. So it's the conditions around the door on the stair side are very important in understanding that. Just that picture is a good one.
Yeah, that's helpful.
We don't have a picture of the other side of that door, do we?
We do in my report, yes, and they are very interesting too. If you look at them in sequence on every level.
Yeah.
Yes, I think that's in your appendix of photographs.
Right, and they suggest that the doors actually responded well.
So the doors remain stable. They haven't collapsed. They have undergone significant charring due to heat, and you can see, very unfortunately, the condition of the lobby. This is level 19, I think you said. Okay, so that door has remained in place despite those conditions.
Thank you.
Yeah. Now, as we've discussed previously, you consider that the design basis for Grenfell Tower was CP3 1971, and you've explained in your report that the CP3 1971 requirement for access to the main stairway was for something called Type 2 doors. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Can we just look at that definition? If we go within your report to BLAS 5030 at page 67, under I 5.2.5, and if we can zoom in on the Type 2 door definition. Thank you. So there you've concluded that the Type 2 door must have a 25 millimeter rebate. Is that correct?
Yeah. So that's pasted directly in from CP3, and for a Type 2 door, it has the 30 minutes performance requirement for collapse and passage of flame, and a rebate is listed there also, of 25 millimetres.
And
Again, the self-closing device.
And you understand that that's a requirement of a 25 millimetre rebate rather than a testing condition, is that correct?
I don't understand the question, I'm really sorry.
You're saying that to comply with the Type 2 door, it needed to have a 25 millimetre rebate, is that correct?
Yes, it did, yes. Sorry, I understand now.
Yeah.
Yes, it did, and test evidence that exists from the time supports the reason why that number is written into the 1971 guidance.
Yeah. In general, can you just explain, first of all, just what a rebate is, just so everybody's clear, and what the effect is of a rebate on, for example, freedom from collapse and passage of flame?
Oh, okay. So a rebate, I think they used to call them like door stops or smoke stops in the old days, and it's just a cut in a piece of timber. So when you push the door, it can't get through the frame at that part. So there's a little slot. Trying to see if there's something to help me.
Are we talking about the depth of the what one might call the door jamb? I mean, how far into the setting the door?
So how
will go?
far into the setting? How far in, and how wide the setting is. So it's got to. It's an L shape. Yeah. Okay. And I know there's been huge interest in rebates. There are drawings in my report with all the dimensions for all the different types of doors. But it's dimensioned, and so the door can't move any further, if you will.
Yeah. And that return on the rebate is potentially important, is it, in terms of the freedom from collapse and the passage of flame or smoke through the door, the L shape and the width of that L shape?
Yes, so I refer to, actually I brought them, I refer to tests done in the 70s by Morris, and it's referenced in my report so people can read it. And he tested a whole series of doors with the same leaf as appears to have been installed in Grenfell Tower, with different rebates. And he found the dimensions to be very important. And he actually concluded, particularly on the 12.5 millimetre rebate, it prevented the ability for a door to achieve, in his testing regime, anything more than 12 minutes fire resistance. Back then.
We'll come back to that in a moment. Just sticking for a moment with the Type 2 doors under CP 371. That also makes clear that it has to have a self-closer, is that correct?
That's correct.
So again, we see self-closers there right back from the 1970s. And you also note in your report that the DCLG sleeping guide is again relevant, which required such doors to be self-closing. Is that correct? You've also mentioned in your report the LGA guidance, which we looked at before, in purpose-built blocks of flats. We can go back to that if you like, but as we noted earlier, that required at least upgraded FD 30S doors. Is that correct?
Yes.
Would you like? Should we look at that again?
It's actually not clear on stair doors. Just sorry, nearly said the wrong thing. It's not clear at all on the replacement or the upgrade of stair doors. It's very clear on flat entrance doors. Yeah,
let's have a look at that. Let's go to CTAR 5033 at page 98. Yeah, so if we zoom in on the table again, and we're on this second to last bullet point, in ventilated lobbies and corridors, travel distances of 10 to 15 metres may be acceptable, provided all doors to the common corridor or lobby are at least upgraded FD 30S doors, and the smoke ventilation comprises PVs or AOVs. I think you say in your report that on one reading of that, all doors to the common corridor or lobby could be interpreted as all doors, including the stair door.
In my opinion,
Yeah.
it should include the stair door.
Yeah. And you've noted that the LGA guidance only recommends upgrading the door so that it's classed as an upgraded door, FD30S door, where the existing door satisfied the specification at the time of construction and was therefore something called a notional FD30 door. Let's look at that in the guidance. Yes. So if we go to page 101 within this document, paragraph 6217. So here it's said in this guidance that it's not practical to test existing doors. 3 options exist. And here what you're referring to is bullet point 1. You can accept the door as it is. Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Accept the door as it is, provided it's a good fit in its frame, and that it satisfied the standard applicable to fire-resisting doors at the time of construction of the building or manufacture of the door. Yeah. And that's what's referred to as a notional FD30 door. Is that correct?
Yes, it is, yeah.
And again, it's just worth looking at the definition of an upgraded FD30S door. That's page 182 within this document.
Yeah.
And if we go, I think it's right at the very top.
Yes, it is.
The notional FD fire-resisting door is a door assembly that satisfied the current specification or fire-resistant test for 30 minutes at the time of construction of a block of flats or manufacture of the door. That's the definition of that.
Yes,
is that correct?
That's correct.
Yeah. Now let's then look at what you saw when you inspected the doors. You say in your report that you inspected one door on level 6, but you consider that door to be representative. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct, based on photographic evidence.
So it does appear from what we've seen that all those doors between levels 4 and 23 were of the same make and construction. Is that correct?
It appears to be the case, yes. There's no documentation available.
And what you've noted is that the stair doors had a rebate depth of 12 millimetres. That's correct?
That's correct.
I think we've got a picture of that. We can look at BLAS 5016 at page 23. I think this picture might help us in terms of... Does that show the rebate?
Not really.
Sorry. Does that help us on showing
really.
the rebate? No.
Anyway,
you'd see the rebate when you open the door.
Yes, when you open the door, you can look in. You see where the edge of the door, where you push the door.
Yeah.
On the frame on the left there.
Yeah.
You'll just see the little stop made of timber.
And you say in your report that rebate depth of 12 millimetres, you say is too small to comply with the requirement for Type 2 doors under CP3 1971. Is that correct?
That's correct.
But what you've said is, following your investigations, the stair doors appear to have been constructed potentially as a Class A door, a number 3 Class A door, under the London Constructional Amending Bylaws. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So right at the beginning of your evidence, we looked at the different regimes that were in place.
Yes.
And there were these London constructional bylaws under the
Yes.
relevant London Building Acts.
Yeah.
And that defines something called a Class A door.
A Type A.
A Type A
door. Yeah.
I apologise. A Type A door.
Yeah.
And what you've concluded is that 12 millimetre rebate would satisfy that standard.
Yeah. So in the London constructional bylaws provides 4 forms of Type A door. The performance resistance is actually 30 minutes, which is the same as a Class 2, a Type 2 door in CP3, okay? So the bylaw door and let's say the CP3 door, the performance resistance is written on paper the same way. The issue with the type doors, so the bylaw doors, is it also gives examples of construction forms one can select to comply with the Type A requirements. And all of them are stated as being allowed to have a rebate of 12.5 millimetres.
But you say in your report, you go on to say that, and this is what you were touching on earlier about the Morris research in the 1970s, that based on certain research you've done, that you've identified from the early 1970s, you've concluded that, in fact, this door may only achieve 20 minutes integrity and 30 minutes stability to the standard applicable at the time of construction. Is that correct?
Yeah, so he discovered, so doors with that rebate were commonly available, let's say, and in his tests he discovered that once the rebate was 12.5 millimetres, the resistance could drop as low as 12 minutes. And if the rebate was increased to 25 millimetres and intumescent strips were also provided to the door leaf we have at Grenfell Tower, and it was very carefully fitted, you could get that door up to a 30-minute, 30-20 standard.
Yeah. So as you say, that was only if what you refer to as tolerances of fit were controlled to less than 1.5 millimetres. Again, can you just have us, what are tolerances of fit?
So he observed in the test that unless the door to frame, the gaps around the door leaf were, it's very tiny. The paper is very interesting to read. Unless they were literally down at a millimetre or two, coupled with a 12.5 millimetre rebate, and even with the 25 millimetre rebate, with that type of door leaf, the rail and style leaf, it really altered their fire performance.
And what you say is you've carefully examined the door, and they do seem very similar to these half-hour fire check doors referred to in a British standard from 1951. Is that correct? Yes,
that's correct. So the door leaf with the rail and style type, so the timbers, if you will, as to how the leaf is made, are the same as something called a British standard fire check door. And they were considered to offer some performance, but not full fire resistance performance. So for a 30-minute door, full fire resistance was 30 minutes, preventing collapse for 30 minutes, integrity for 30 minutes. A fire check door, the collapse regime of 30 minutes was retained, but you couldn't get the integrity at 30, and so a fire check door was 20 minutes instead. So they were considered to act as a fire door, but with a lower performance, with that rail and style leaf.
And so is it on that basis that you consider the performance of that door, the Class A door, doesn't satisfy the same stability and integrity requirements of a Type 2 door under CP3 1971?
That's correct.
Yeah. And you've highlighted in your report that you consider it might be worth thinking about an amendment to relevant guidance, including the LGA guide, because you think it might have to flag up that there may be an entire category of doors still present in tower blocks today, which would have met these lower London constructional bylaw standards, but which in fact have a proven lower performance standard than other doors that were installed in the 70s.
Exactly.
And I think you make clear that even if you upgrade these doors, so you put in smoke seals, intumescent strips, the performance is potentially still concerning because of those original issues.
To do with the closeness of fit and whatever rebate is installed in that building or this building. And that's very well documented in various papers. I've given the publications in my report.
Yeah. Now, let's just go back and look at figure I-26 on BLAS 5030 at page 78, and look at what we see in terms, if we could blow up figure I-26.
Yeah.
And it's right, isn't it, that you've done certain detective work in terms of looking really carefully at these doors and trying to work out what may have happened to them over time.
Yes, I have.
And
yes.
You note here in the label below, you say brush seal present, unknown if intumescent steel present below the brush seal.
Yes.
So can you just explain to us what a brush seal is?
Well, it can be to stop drafts or it could be for the purposes of cold smoke. I don't know what's underneath it. I haven't done a destructive test of the door. And if, therefore, there's intumescent hidden behind it, which would act in the event of a fire to seal up the door for fire resistance purposes.
So just to be clear, an intumescent seal would be different to a brush.
I think so. It would be
seal.
Underneath it. I showed some pictures of standard products in my report. It should be underneath there, as I understand it.
Yeah. And that's what you've said in your report, that you say it's unclear whether there may be an intumescent seal underneath the brush seal.
Yes.
And that only if we did a destructive analysis could we be able to definitively confirm that. Is that correct?
Just need to take it out of the door and have a look. Yeah.
And you've also noted, based on the documents you've seen so far, that there's potentially inconsistent factual evidence at this stage as to whether cold smoke seals, possibly combined with an intumescent seal, could have been retrospectively installed in order to upgrade these stair doors. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And again, so the difference between a cold smoke seal and an intumescent seal, what's the difference between those two things?
So I think there's conflicting evidence about if works were done to the stair door, and if the works consisted of installing something, as we can see here on the leaf, what exactly those works were. Yeah. Okay, it's not just about if it was a cold seal or an intumescent seal.
Yeah.
So different parties have provided different evidence regarding whether works have been done to the stair door or not since the tower was constructed. And in reviewing photos from the time of the primary refurbishment, showing seals being installed on one or two doors, I still cannot conclude what the seal was for and how many doors it was installed on or not.
Yeah. So those you note that some photos have been provided by Mr. Stokes that show a seal in some doors that's visually similar to a combined cold smoke and intumescent seal.
Yes.
You're not clear whether work was done to all the doors or
No.
just some of the doors at this stage. Is that correct?
That's correct. And I've provided a series of photographs in my report to explain why. I can see a combined seal in a photo, but I can't see that it has been consistently installed. And there's a conflict in whether works were done at all, as I've explained in my report.
So at this stage, can we draw any conclusions as to whether or not...
I won't draw a conclusion about what works were done, but I acknowledge that there is a brush seal installed on some doors.
Yeah.
I don't know what it's for, who put it there, or why.
And is this something that could be looked at further at phase 2, investigated further as necessary?
Yes, I hope the relevant information will be provided to me so I can close that out. And I intend to do a destructive test of the door myself.
You do intend to do that now?
Yes, I do.
Yeah. Now, you note that the BRE has carried out testing to a stair door. And that was found, we're going to look at the test report in a second, to have just 16 minutes integrity and 3 minutes installation. Yes. If we just pull up the test report, that's MET 000021780. And if we can go, that's the test report dated September 2018. If we can go to internal page 22 of this test report. And if we could just zoom in on that a little.
Yeah.
So this is the condition of the door after 16 minutes, is that correct?
That's correct. As recorded by the BRE. Yeah.
And we see, I mean, this is one of the stair doors from Grenfell Tower.
Yes,
is that
it is,
correct?
yes.
Yeah. And we see the glazing unit, and then we can see a little bit of flame at the top
Exactly.
left hand, and smoke around the edges. Is
Yes.
that correct? And then let's go, the installation, the 3 minutes installation is recorded at page 13 of 23.
Yeah.
If we go back into page 13, there we see.
Yes.
Again, can you just remind us of the difference between integrity and insulation?
Yeah, so you typically don't have to provide insulation on a fire door because it can open, and ideally there isn't storage of combustibles up against the door. And insulation is to do with preventing heat transfer onto the onto the cold side, the unheated side. Integrity is about preventing flames through cracks. So I'd imagine that when there's a cotton pad, when they put that near the flame up on the top left-hand corner, that's why they recorded failure.
Yeah. Now, to be fair, you note that the testing standard that was applied by the BRE is a more recent, you say it's a 1987 version of BS 476.
Yes, yes.
Than would have been applicable at the time of construction of Grenfell Tower.
Yes.
So you say it's not directly comparable with the 30-minute requirement at the time of construction.
At the time, that's correct,
Is
yes.
that right?
Yes. It's a more difficult test to pass, if you will, because of the pressure. They introduced a pressure differential it was in the 70s.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So a positive pressure against the door.
Exactly, and it's more likely the products of combustion would pass through.
So we need to bear that in mind when we're looking at that test report.
Yes, we do.
Yeah. And just to clarify, so that was one of the stair doors from Grenfell Tower. Do you think that is a representative of the stair doors we're concerned with between levels 4 and 23, as far as you're aware?
So in the BRE test report, I couldn't find information on the seal to the door they tested, and that would be useful to know. And then, coupled with hopefully more information from relevant parties, we could close out the matter of what seal was there or not, and I could make a more final conclusion on the actual fire resistance of the stair door, noting that I haven't observed a failure caused by the door in the staircase with respect to that damage I mentioned. So these are technical matters rather than something that might substantially change my opinion.
Yeah. Again, is it potentially relevant that we see varying damage of the stair doors still in situ in Grenfell Tower, with some of them only marginally damaged and perhaps seem to have held up reasonably well?
Yes.
Is that correct?
That's correct. And we're back again to this situation of the hazard in a location, the conditions in that location, and so what was imposed upon that door over time.
And then finally on this subtopic, you've highlighted in your report that if you compared these stair doors with the current guidance in ADB 2013, current standards require a stair door to achieve FD 60 minutes integrity. Is that correct?
That's correct, for firefighting stair protection.
So that's strictly the modern standard and doesn't take into account any non-worsening principle or non-worsening in relation to the stair doors?
Oh, I'm not giving any view on non-worsening at the moment, but the statutory guidance at this time is for a 60-minute door to a firefighting shaft.
Yeah. Now, again, just some similar questions about stair doors to flat doors. Would you agree that they're never going to provide indefinite protection against fire? They're only ever going to last for, if they were upgraded doors, 30 minutes, even if they're ADB doors, 60 minutes, and that they would generally be expected to fail at some point.
Well,
do you think that that's something we need to bear in mind? And
I'm not sure, because I don't know what, I'd have to say, what is the definition of indefinite protection? There is a performance required for specific reasons. This issue of not replacing doors and simply upgrading them without having to contemplate anything else I don't understand, so that guidance in the LGA. So I typically don't recommend myself notional fire doors, for example, in my own work. So in my mind, I understand in a major flashover fire, at some point the door may fail, but it's actually of considerable importance for the time before that very severe heating occurs. Hence the S rating, the door closer, and everything else about a fire door. It's about its function in the early, middle, and late stages of a fire.
Yeah. Again, do you think it'd be possible to estimate how much smoke might seep through a closed, non-compliant door as compared with a door which was compliant, either original standards or modern standards, and would that exercise be relevant and helpful?
So there are very clever smoke modelling people out there. I am not one of them. And that is a numerical analysis that could be carried out if a person thought it would be relevant, yes.
You'd have to know the manner in which the door was not compliant, though, wouldn't you?
You certainly would, and you'd have to understand the hazard posed to that door over time.
Yeah. And is that something you consider would be useful for your work going forward?
I don't feel the need to do that at this time.
Yeah, and then finally on this topic, and I think you yourself mentioned it, there is some firefighter evidence from the night that some of the stair doors, when shut, were fairly effective at preventing smoke from entering the stairs.
Yes.
There's a number of examples of that we had in some of the oral and written evidence.
Yes.
Do you think that evidence is potentially significant when we consider the importance of any performance non-compliances that you found in the doors?
Yes, exactly. So there's non-compliance and then there's performance during a hazard. And yes, that must be considered. And that's why I keep saying what happens in each location will become very important.
Yeah. A slightly different topic now, the refuse chute doors. I just want some very brief questions about the refuse chute doors. So on each of the lobbies, next to the stair door, along from the stair door, to the other side of the service riser cupboard, is a door that goes on to a refuse chute that residents could use. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And you note that CP3 1971 set no standard for any refuse chute doors.
For the door itself, just for its location and the location of the chute itself not being in an escape route, and the requirement for permanent ventilation, but not for the door. Yeah.
Do you agree that based on your inspections at the tower that those wooden refuse chute doors appear to have fared better than the stair doors?
They do appear to, because it's in the tower during my inspections I observed the cleanliness and lack of fire and smoke damage in nearly every refuse chute area. It was very striking.
Yeah. Do you think those refuse chute rooms could potentially have been used as safe places for residents waiting to be rescued?
I understand. One has those thoughts. I did have such thoughts myself on site, but the reality is knowing where they are, making a decision about them being safe or not. I just don't know how anyone could have made that decision during the fire. And I understand that they appear to have been safe because of their post-fire condition, but I couldn't honestly say that it's something that would have been reasonable to consider. And also, one or two of them actually are, particularly at level 7, there was one that was very severely damaged. The other important thing about that area is there is actually mechanical ventilation apparently provided to that room. I don't have enough information on it yet, but I will be looking at the effect that had in terms of smoke in the lobby also. But I couldn't say that it should have been considered and that it should be considered. No.
A new topic now, gas. Now, your Appendix K is serving as effectively a briefing document for the specialist gas expert that the inquiry's appointed, Mr. Rodney Hancock. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Now, on that basis, I've just a few questions for you on this topic, because this is going to be addressed in much more detail by Mr. Hancock when he opines in his written report. But one of the topics I want to ask you about is about penetrations that may be relevant to the gasworks at the tower. In particular about the penetration between the stairs and the lobbies, which you've identified as potential routes of smoke spread between levels during the fire.
Yes.
Now, is it right that you've concluded that the wall of the stairwell, which, as you've explained, is a protected shaft, the stairs, that it was breached on 13 floors between the 4th and the 21st floor? Is that correct?
Are we able to show a photo
yes,
at all? Yeah,
that's
okay.
my next, exactly. If we can look at your figure K23, that's BLAS 5032 at page 24. Yes, and if we zoom in on K23, which is at the top of that page.
Yeah, so...
you explain what we're seeing in this photo.
So this is on the lobby side. So you mentioned there on the stair side, a protected shaft was built. There is no information on how it was built and its fire performance, and that would be useful to have. And that appears, though, as I've said in my report, to have performed effectively in the sense, again, there's no significant heat damage or damage to the concrete enclosure to the staircase in that area at the moment. Separately, on the lobby side, where this gas pipe leaves the staircase enclosure, it breaks through the concrete. And now we're out on a lobby near flat 1 and 2. Yes. What I don't know is Cadent have said they were going to box this in the same way they boxed in the staircase. Those works hadn't taken place by the time the fire occurred. They were due around that time. What I don't know is if there's a fire stopping material at the back of this hole in the wall or not. And I will need to work very closely with the gas expert and review his survey data to understand if that hole there was sealed. Now that wouldn't impact the stair because the stair is boxed in. I don't know if we can...
I was about to take you to a photo.
Yeah, maybe show that.
Yeah.
What it does affect is that actually acts as a link from lobby to lobby, because at the next pipe run above, on the next nearest floor, if the same hole is there, smoke from one lobby could travel up and out to the next lobby. But I don't know that, and I need that information about the fire stopping on the stair wall to lobby line.
Yeah.
So the staircase seems clear. The lobby requires further attention.
Yeah, yeah. Just before we leave this photo, we will go to the one on the stair side in a moment.
Yeah.
So these were penetrations through the wall to accommodate pipes referred to as laterals. Is that correct?
Laterals. They're just running out. Yeah.
And this was all part of the new gas riser installation for riser number 2. So there were, I think, 5 risers coming up, and one of those risers was being replaced for the flat 2s.
There were 6 coming up, and this was the replacement riser, and it was run through the staircase and brought out through the wall of the staircase out onto the lobbies that required a gas supply. It looks like that.
Yeah.
And then you can see it entering the flat here at the wall there. And again, I don't know what that seal there is either.
Yeah. So let's look at what it looks like from the other side. Figure K22, I think, on page 23.
Yeah.
Yeah, if we... so you've highlighted these, I think. This is level 13 and level 21.
Yeah.
Is it right? What we can see is the boxing in on the stair side.
Yes.
I think on the right-hand picture, you can see the vertical boxing in down the side, and then the boxing in at the top of the wall.
Yeah,
is that
that's correct. So here's the vertical gas run boxed in, and here, because this is a floor where it's going to come out onto the lobby, it comes across and then it goes out onto the lobby side.
Yeah. So what we were seeing in the other photograph was what's going on the other side.
On the other side, yes.
In the lobby side.
Yes.
You've highlighted these two photographs in particular because what you say is there are missing panels.
That's correct.
At the end of these, but to be fair, what you say in your report is they could have been taken off by somebody after the fire.
Yeah, so
you're not clear at the moment.
Yeah, it could be as part of some work by the police. That samples of materials have been taken by the time I got to site.
Yeah.
But in terms of it is a hole in the protection. But if you just look again, it's about looking at the damage around it. You can see here at level 13, yes, the light is damaged, but I'm explaining that later on with regards to the door. At 21, you can see there's no severe damage, for example, to the concrete. So at the moment, I've no reason to believe they were particularly relevant. But it will be very helpful to get a proper explanation of those works.
Yeah. And the significance, just to be absolutely clear, the significance is that potentially otherwise there's a compromising of the stair compartment by virtue of these holes.
Those holes.
Yeah. Lobby to lobby is what you're saying.
But the ones I showed earlier, it's about smoke being able to flow from one lobby to the next through the breaches on the stair wall.
Through the trunking we see on the stairs.
No. So
I mean, what's the route for the...
If it's a pity we don't have a sealed one actually. Is there? If this was one of the sealed trunkings, if there is fire and smoke in the lobby, and that fire stopping isn't there on the line, smoke can enter this space. And all of this is connected on every floor within the box.
This space, you mean the
within
boxing?
in the box.
Yeah.
It's connected then at every floor within the box. So it mightn't break out onto the staircase, but it could flow through the box.
I understand that.
Back out to another floor.
That's fine. Yeah. And I know you've said you want to do further investigations. Are you able to give any opinion at this stage about the significance of this breach of compartmentation in terms of smoke spread on the night?
So with regards to the fire stopping on the lobby line, if it was not there, I would be very concerned about it as a route for fire and smoke spread. But I very much want to get proper information about the fire stopping at that line before I stray into that territory.
I understand. Just on another topic linked to this question of breaches of compartmentation, and then we might have another break. Ventilation ducts in the bathrooms.
Oh, yes.
So it's been suggested that there appear, and I'm afraid I don't have any photographs, but that there appear to have been ventilation ducts in each of the 6 bathrooms in each floor.
That's correct.
Is that correct?
That is correct.
And is it right that they run in pairs vertically through the building?
Yes, that is correct. Yes, I think in pairs. Yeah.
And it's been suggested that from level 9, the boxing in of those vertical risers appears to have been destroyed by fire. Is that correct?
I observed significant damage during my time on site, yes.
Have you conducted any detailed inspection of those?
I have. Me and my team actually tracked those risers, and it's something that I will go to look at in the next stage of my work. Because like every other riser, they connect every floor, and my understanding from the limited information made available to me is there may have been some new ventilation provided through those risers also.
Yeah. So do you think this is something that's important to investigate in terms of the spread of smoke throughout the building?
Yes, I do.
Great, thank you. Mr. Chairman, that's probably
Is that a good point?
A good point for another break. Yes, thank you.
Right. Well, we'll have another break now.
Oh,
Is that right?
Okay, okay, thank
Good.
you.
Right. Same drill as before, off with the usher. We'll come back at 12:10.
Yes, that's great.
Right, 12:10, please. Yes. Right, Dr. Lane. Happy to go on?
Yes, actually, I thought I should probably clarify something. You asked me why the laterals and verticals, how they connect within the staircase.
What I wanted to make sure I understood was that the route of smoke transfer between lobbies on different floors was through the boxing, the trunking.
Exactly.
I thought that was the route, but I just wanted to clarify that. So
and the reason why it could happen is there is a statutory duty to ventilate that boxing and to provide ventilation to it in the relevant gas legislation, and it's considered so important. The fire safety legislation also makes that clear, and the only way the laterals and the verticals can be ventilated is if they're fully open to each other. So it will be useful to understand the detailing around that.
Thank you, that's helpful.
Yeah.
Yes, Ms. Grange.
Yes, thank you. Just a few questions about the hot zone or hot spot that you identified in your report. So in your first report, you found evidence of the plastic stair lights on levels 13, 14, and also the half levels on 13 and 14 had been fully destroyed, whereas the plastic stair lights above that on levels 15, the half level of level 15 and 16, you say were deformed or just partially melted. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
And you also found significant evidence of damage to the lobbies and the stair doors on those levels as well, where the lights were completely deformed.
General, yes, I did.
And you considered that this was potentially significant evidence in terms of a hot zone or hot spot in the middle of the stairs at around levels 13 to 16, is that correct?
Yes.
Where you say you think temperatures may have got above 150 degrees Celsius, is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Now, in your revised report, and having heard the factual evidence that you've heard, you've highlighted a particular rescue operation described by firefighter DeForge around levels 10, 11, with the stair door being held open after 2 a.m., 2:10 a.m. possibly. And you've also noted some resident witness statements which indicate a lot of firefighter activity around level 14 at around the same time. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And you said at this stage in your report that the strongest evidence of the cause of the plastic light damage in this hot spot is smoke and heat entering the stairs from open doors, possibly due to this firefighter activity. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Does that remain your view based on what you've heard so far?
At this stage, yes, it is.
Is it also possible that the reason why there's a hot spot or hot zone might be explained, for example, by gas fires burning later in the piece? Do you think that's potentially another source of those hot zones or hot spots?
So I presume what that's meant to mean is causing a heating beside the stair door so extreme it can radiate through the materials and melt the lights. I have no evidence available to me that that is possible as a function of how I understand the location of the gas risers in the flats.
So you think at the moment it's much more likely that this is due to firefighter actions at in that part of the building?
Yes, and I think in my April report I put the timing after the change in stay put advice, but a careful analysis of resident evacuations shows that there's a period of time between about 1:45 and 2:25 where no one exited the tower from above that zone. But later on, then, evacuation from that zone and above occurs. And that's how at the moment, that's how I've honed in on the time.
Yeah, that's very helpful. I'm now going to turn to consider some of the active fire safety systems in the building. And in general, I think it's right here, we're looking at requirements B1 and B5, means of warning and escape, and facilities to assist the firefighters to save life and allow for fire engine access. Those are the key parts of the building regulations, the functional requirements.
That's correct, yeah.
And I want to start just with some brief questions about the interface between fire detection and alarms. And you have concluded in your report that there is no requirement to have a centralised alarm system. Is that correct? In a building like Grenfell Tower.
That's correct. There's no requirement to provide an alarm sound or voice message in one or all of the parts. That's correct.
And what you've said in your report is that there's a useful explanation in BS 55881/1990 on the reason why there's no statutory requirement for a common alarm system. Can we just look at that?
Yes.
So that's BLAS 5015 at page 15 at the top of the page. So here it says there's no statutory requirement for a common fire alarm system to be provided in a building solely containing flats and or maisonettes. And in buildings designed and constructed in accordance with this code, it is generally unnecessary and undesirable for a fire alarm system to be provided. A common fire alarm system ought to be provided only in a building in which some control can be achieved over the occupants so that a predetermined response leading to the evacuation of the building can be triggered. And then it says in flats and maisonettes in normal use, this kind of response cannot be achieved, nor is it necessarily desirable that evacuation should take place from areas remote from the fire unless these areas themselves become threatened by fire.
That's correct.
And you've obviously thought it was important in your report to highlight these particular features of that British standard in terms of why an all-out alarm is not necessary. Is that right? Is there anything more you want to say on that?
No, I think it's that concept about either accidental or malicious false alarms, or, say people would have said before, if someone burns their toast in one flat, you don't want the whole building having to evacuate. That would have been the kind of general view, and why that kind of all-out function hasn't been provided to date in residential buildings.
Yeah. And you say in this context that it's important to understand what alternatives there are available for raising the alarm throughout the whole building, which brings us to chapter 18 of your report, which is about communication with residents. Yes. Is that correct?
Yes.
So I'm going to ask you some questions about that chapter, that not very many, but just some questions.
Yes.
So in that chapter of your report, you consider the possible means available to the London Fire Brigade of communicating with residents during the fire and once the stay put strategy was formally changed. Is that correct?
That's correct.
First, I want to ask you about loud hailers. You note that this is part of the LFB inventory equipment, but you consider it impractical due to other background noise at the fireground and the height and proportions of Grenfell Tower. Is that correct?
Yep, that's correct.
And I think you note that loud hailers were used, but for very specific reasons. For example, if there were concerns about people's safety, safety jumping, or
yes. Sorry, I just would really like to say that I've looked into these features because the building design, the provisions with the building itself provides nothing at all for communication. And so I was trying to find other methods instead. But I want to emphasise the absence of any form of communication device, not just a sounder, in the building itself. Yeah.
Firefighters knocking on doors.
Yes.
That's another thing that you've considered. You note the difficulty with doing this if done for the whole tower block. And I think you note that you would require significant resources and significant numbers of firefighters to be deployed to all floors.
Yes, that's correct.
And also logistical issues, whether you break in, if there's no answer, there may be all sorts of logistical difficulties you've sought to highlight.
Exactly, to do it methodically in such circumstances.
And you've concluded that this issue of communication with residents and available methods should be explored further, given the number of other buildings with a stay put policy. Is that correct?
Yeah, so the number of other buildings with a stay put policy and an external wall that supports the spread of fire.
Yeah. I want to ask you about the option on the night for the LFB to use the door intercom system, as Fatima Alves appears to have done, to communicate with other residents. Now, I think it's right that you've now considered that question in detail at section 18.8 of your report, pages 21 to 24.
Yes.
And in particular, is it right, you've sought to draw attention to the functionality of the intercom system in terms of what it could and couldn't do?
Yes.
Which you think is relevant to this, is that right?
Yeah, that's correct. So, I mean, my understanding from the information I have about the intercom system, it wasn't installed as a life safety feature. A life safety feature requires backup power and other more resilient features to make sure it will work during a fire. But in terms of using it on an ad hoc basis, I've looked into what the system could potentially do. And I think the list on...
Yeah, I was going to take you to paragraph 18.8.6.
Yes.
That's BLAS 5018 at page 23. Yeah, so I think that this is your summary here. The intercom was not installed with the necessary robustness to make it a formal life safety system. If firefighters wish to use the intercom as an ad hoc means to communicate with residents, a flat number would need to be dialed and the firefighter would need to wait until a resident answered.
That's correct, yes.
If a resident did not answer from the flat, the firefighter would have no way of knowing if the flat was empty, or the resident was incapacitated or otherwise unable to come to the intercom, or if the system had been muted for the night.
That's
so
correct.
Again, have you noted that you can mute the system?
There is there is a muting function that you can program in, and I have no information about how that operated at Grenfell Tower at this time.
Yeah, and then I think the last point that you've made is there are also other ways that use of such a system would not be effective, such as if the communications cable was affected by the fire. So that's
correct. And also there's other timings programmed into the system in terms of how long it will ring the flat fire, how long one is allowed to speak on the phone, and all sorts of other functions. Again, we don't have that information at the moment, but all of that contributes to it not necessarily being a robust means of contacting every single flat methodically.
Yeah. So based on what you know at the moment, do you think that was a practical option for use on the night?
I understand that it's something that could be done in the circumstances at Grenfell Tower. I don't know how one would go about using it effectively as was required that night with the number of people waiting for rescue.
And you've also expressed concerns in that chapter as to how the limitations on communications would affect those who require assistance to escape in the event of fire. Is that correct?
That's correct. That's something I'm, actually very concerned about.
Yeah, can you just briefly explain your concerns?
Well, the issue for any person who isn't fully mobile for whatever reason there will be a category of person who lived at Grenfell Tower who could never use the staircase or could only use the staircase with difficulty. I think we might talk about lifts later. There was no proper firefighting lift for evacuation. And so when it came to rescue not being possible and self-evacuation was the only means to leave the tower, that left that category of person in a very hazardous condition, as I've been mentioning earlier. And there is no statutory duty at this time to provide such means explicitly set out in the design guidance, and I find that very concerning, to say the least.
Emergency lighting and signage. You dealt with that in chapter 15 of your report. Just a few questions on this.
Yes.
You say on lighting that you're not able to tell whether the system complied with approved document B 2010 because the lighting is now damaged and you can't determine if it complied with the relevant 3-hour requirement for emergency lighting in sleeping accommodation that would be required in that guidance.
Yeah, so I don't have any drawings actually or specification. I think it's probably worth explaining. Emergency lighting only switches on if there is a power failure. Artificial lighting is required at all times on the escape route. So there's adequate lighting on the escape route, and then in the event of a power failure, that a certain number of lights can switch on and maintain the adequate lighting to the escape route. I'm not aware at the moment there was necessarily a power failure, and I need more information to be able to explain if an adequate quantity of lighting was provided on the escape route to give a view on its compliance. So it's two things: power failure, but without power failure, an adequate quantity of lights or luminaires.
There is some evidence of a failure of lobby emergency lighting.
Yes.
Now you note that once the lobby's filled with black smoke, the lighting would have been of little use. But would it potentially have been significant if the lights have failed earlier than they should have?
Yeah, so it will. So if the lobby was filled with black smoke, it might be that the light was on, but because of its relative illuminance with the smoke particles, quite simply one can't see it, rather than it had failed off, or the lighting in that lobby in themselves may have failed during the fire.
Now, given the difficulties that were experienced by the firefighters in reading the floor numbers, which were placed directly beneath the lighting on the stairs, are you able to comment on the lighting and the floor numbering? In particular, do you think the floor numbers should have been more clearly marked than they were?
So I've observed that on some parts of the stair, the emergency lighting actually covers over the number, and in other parts of the stair, the number is present. I didn't actually check if the number was correct when I was at the tower. Is there
anything in any of the statutory guidance or other relevant guidance?
No, so that's what I was going to say. So it's interesting that if you think about this adequate lighting on an escape route, the absence of guidance on adequate lighting on, say, a floor number sign for orientating oneself as a firefighter, that's not something that's a duty at this time. But there is evidence from other fires too that orientation of the firefighters can be very difficult. So I think that is something that should be considered. Adequate lighting with proper, orientation information, so firefighters can be clear about where they are.
I want to turn now to some questions about the fire main at Grenfell Tower. And you've dealt with this in chapter 2 and then 14 and 15 of your report. I want to make sure you've got those to hand.
It's okay, keep going, I'll be fine. Yeah, just too many papers on my desk.
Now,
do you want a moment to sort them out?
No, I'll be okay. I'll tell you
right.
if I get stuck.
Now, you explain in your report that in modern design codes, the regulations require provisions only for internal firefighting in high-rise buildings.
That's correct.
And you've looked first at CP3 1971, the design guidance you think applied when Grenfell was constructed. And you've concluded that the risers you think were non-compliant because there should have been provision for a wet riser given the height of the building. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So Grenfell Tower is more than 60 metres. It was measured at 65.49 using the relevant height criteria under CP3 71. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And what we have at Grenfell Tower is dry risers.
Yes.
Can we just look, again, just to orientate ourselves as to what we're talking about here, just look at some of the pictures of those dry risers that you have at Grenfell Tower in your report. If you go to BLAS 5014, page 117, figure 14.56. So BLAS 5014 at page 117. So there we have examples of the dry risers, and we're going to come to this in a minute, but these are in the lobbies, aren't they?
Yes.
And basically these are places where the firefighters plug in their hoses to conduct the firefighting.
That's correct.
Yeah. And it looks like the particular type may have slightly this particular details in different bits of the tower, is that correct?
Well, I think this picture is a little bit confusing because it shows the newer image provided for the new works.
Yes, the level 2 outlets.
Rather
level
consistently
3.
The level 4 to level 23. So maybe just.
And so the ones at the bottom, level 4 looks like that, level 9 looks like that. Yeah. And you said that under modern design guidance, that's approved document B 2013, a wet riser was also required. Can you just briefly explain for us the difference between a wet riser and a dry riser?
Yeah, so a dry riser is empty in normal use, and the fire brigade arrive and pump the water from, I call it the town mains, or the area water supply, through pumping equipment into the riser. It pumps the water up through the riser and makes it then available for use on any floor. A wet rising main is what's called permanently charged by means of tanks and pumps in the building. And so the only action for the fire brigade is to go to the floor and operate the system on the floor that it's needed.
And presumably top up the tanks from time to time if necessary.
The tanks are connected to the town main.
Oh, are they? Direct
right?
connection.
That's the idea. And so they should be replenished if they're emptied or being used. That's the idea.
Right.
Yeah, no, I just want to look at what you've said in your report of paragraph 15.8.17. That's BLAS 15 at page 37 of chapter 15. And here, what you've done, yes, if we could zoom in on 15.8.17, you say that this relevant design standard, BS 9990/2006, gives us some reasons why you have taller buildings requiring wet fire mains. Yeah. So what it says there, wet fire mains should be installed owing to the pressures required to provide adequate firefighting water supplies at the landing valves at upper floors, and also to ensure that water is immediately available at all floor levels.
Yeah, that's correct, because in a dry rising main, the taller the floor, the more difficult, if you will, it is to pump the water there. It's entirely possible, but it becomes more difficult with heights.
And I now want to go to what you say, and this is crystallised in your summary and conclusions chapter. This is in chapter 2.
Yes.
If we look at BLAS 602 at page 66, and it's paragraphs 2.23.24 and 25. Those two, if we can make those big. So you say there, in a wet riser, the system would already have been charged with a pump connected when the LFB arrived. There would have been no operations required by LFB to find external hydrants, connect to their pumping appliance, and connect to the riser inlet. Therefore, the provision of a dry main would have contributed to increasing the time required by the LFB to get water to the initial fire event in flat 16. And then you say at the following paragraph, therefore, a wet fire main could have enabled a faster initial response time to the fire in flat 16, which might have increased the chances of extinguishing the fire before it spread externally. However, it cannot be asserted it would have absolutely achieved this.
That's correct.
So I just want to ask you some questions about this speed of setup topic.
Okay, yep.
Now, that is potentially consistent with what Watch Manager Dowden said in his evidence. On day 3, on the 27th of June, he said, but generally, as a rule of thumb, it will increase our timing, decrease the time to make a compartment entry, yes.
Yes.
However, do you agree that the chairman will also need to consider the factual evidence more broadly about whether firefighters in fact had to wait to use the dry riser?
Do I agree? Yes, I do agree. Yes.
Yeah. That he'll have to look at whether there's evidence as to whether they actually had to wait for the water and whether they were ready to go in any event.
Yes, I that's not something I've analysed at all. Yes.
And just on this, do you accept that the activity of connecting a supply to the dry riser and also the fire crews setting up at the bridgehead are likely to be simultaneous activities?
That's a matter for a firefighting expert to give a view on.
Yeah. Another topic on this is about the use of a wet main to cool the lobbies.
Yes.
If we go back again within chapter 2 of your report to 223.26, that's chapter 2 BLAS 602, page 66. I think it's the same page we were just on. If we can just zoom in on that paragraph 223.26.
Yeah.
So you've said this there, a wet fire main could have enabled greater water pressure for firefighting on the upper floors of Grenfell Tower, which may have allowed LFB to use water to cool lobbies and Stair, and therefore provide more assistance to people trying to escape.
Yeah, so this this is something I'm very interested in terms of understanding hazards to people in specific locations, because the design condition is to have a wet rising main which can cope with 2 hoses operating at the same time. And I just would like to hear some more about, if that condition was present at Grenfell Tower, how it could have been used in the context of rescue. The 2 hoses are very important because that's about protecting crews, and in the beginning it should be about extinguishing the fire and protecting the crew. But I would like to understand later on, if that provision had been available, a wet rising main with 2 functioning hoses, and it could have been applied that way with 2 functioning hoses, how that might have assisted protecting crews and dealing with localised conditions in the lobby. I would like to hear about that from a firefighting expert.
When you talk about 2 functioning hoses,
yeah,
what exactly do you have in mind?
So the water supply is meant to be sufficient, through the wet rising main to allow the full operation of 2 hoses simultaneously.
Right.
So I accept entirely that if you've multiple hoses at the same time, even with the wet riser, the situation changes. But if one used it as it was designed, if it had been provided, how can that assist protecting crews and dealing with a localised firefighting to aid rescue only? I can't take that off the table as such.
Okay. Can we just look at paragraphs 15.8.22 and 2.3 within the body of your report? That's BLAS 5015 at 38.
Yeah.
And here you give some comparison calculations. You say to compare the performance of wet and dry fire main systems, I've calculated whether the dry fire main in Grenfell Tower could provide an equivalent flow rate, litres per second, and pressure of water bar to the design requirements for a wet fire main system. Yeah. In summary, I've found that assuming 2 hoses operating in the building, one each at levels 22 and 23, the pressure at the outlet would be 2.57 bar. This is 32% of the pressure required by ADB for a wet rising main. Is that correct?
Yeah, I wanted to try it. It's a simple theoretical analysis where all the water conditions are the same outside the tower, and it was just for the purposes of comparing a dry and wet riser in that context to try and illustrate how it's different, and how it would be potentially different in a building the height of Grenfell Tower.
And then you go on to say, similarly, to deliver the equivalent pressure to a wet fire main on the highest floors, the pressure required at ground level would be 15.5 bar. This is over 50% more than the maximum operating pressure that dry fire mains are designed for, 10 bar.
Yes,
is that correct?
That's correct. Yes, that's correct.
So I think you've accepted, and you did, I think, make this point in your original report, that even with a wet main, pumps and water supplies are not designed for multiple fire streams. Is that correct?
Beyond 2.
Yeah.
But I think understanding how 2 could have been used is important.
So at Grenfell Tower, would any shortcomings which were encountered in respect of the water pressure for the dry riser potentially also have been encountered for the wet riser due to the number of hydrants which were in use?
Eventually, but there's proper expert detail required to understand the impact of the firefighting on the town main, and I wouldn't like to
and it's probably
there. But yes, the more water that was used externally, in just very simple terms, I presume it impacted the water available for internal firefighting. And that proper analysis of network flows needs to be done.
And that's going to be done by probably Ivan Stoyanov, who's been appointed as the water expert, yes. And potentially, presumably, Steve McGurk, the firefighting expert, may need to look at that as well.
So I accept, because of all the ad hoc firefighting that became required outside the building, even though that's not what's meant to be required, all the ad hoc firefighting will now have to be reviewed in the context of the remaining water internally. But the evidence shows the effectiveness of the external firefighting at the levels it was possible, as I've explained in my report.
So on this basis, once the fire has spread to multiple floors and they're doing firefighting in a large number of locations, would you accept that the wet riser may not have made a material difference?
Once it went beyond 2 hoses, as I said.
Just moving to a slightly different point, you've said that under approved document B 2013, the risers, if according to those current standards, have to be located within the stair enclosure and not within the lobbies.
That's the recommendation,
That's if the current standards apply.
Yes, it is, yes.
Do you consider that the siting of the outlets in the lobbies rather than the protected stairwell may have affected the firefighting effort within Grenfell Tower?
Well, I observe in the evidence available to us that trying to get that distance to the dry riser and in the shape of the lobby as it was, it did pose difficulties to London Fire Brigade, as they have said themselves. And because of the conditions in the Grenfell Tower fire, the lobbies became a hazardous area. Whereas if the dry riser was in the staircase in those extreme circumstances, that's something to contemplate.
Do you think that using a wet riser reduces the risk of compromise of the water supply caused by falling debris?
I couldn't answer that question,
Okay.
sorry.
Yeah. In terms of fire spread on the external wall,
Yes.
do you think that the presence of a dry riser rather than a wet riser made any difference in terms of the firefighters' ability to fight that external wall fire?
I actually don't understand that question, because the cladding fire was dealt with from outside the building for several hours. Yeah. Not with the dry riser. So I don't understand the question.
Yeah. Would you accept that in an extended incident, such as that which was encountered at Grenfell Tower, had wet risers been used, the capacity of the tanks may have been exceeded early on in the fire?
Indeed, and I think the analysis of the network supply in the area and around the building, therefore, is a useful exercise to understand what impact that might have had to replenishing those tanks.
Just looking...
At that point, if you have a wet riser, you've got to draw water from the local mains.
Yes.
And if you've got a dry riser, you're drawing water from the local mains. So
eventually,
the difference is going to lie in the pumping capacity of the fixed pumps for the wet riser and the fire brigade's engines for the other.
Absolutely. And not exceeding, I keep saying 2 hoses, not exceeding the design basis of the wet rising system, which isn't 10 hoses, 20 hoses, it's 2 hoses. That's exactly the pumping equipment and staying within the design limits of the system, and how one would do that systematically in an extreme event. That's the kind of information, an expert in firefighting would need to bring.
Yeah, yeah. Just one set of questions on this topic now. Take the dry riser as a dry riser. Do you have any? Have you seen any evidence that suggests it didn't perform adequately as a dry riser? As in, do you have any evidence that it didn't achieve the pressure that you would expect a dry riser to achieve?
I was going to say, well, a dry riser is a dry riser. No, the early firefighting, the evidence from early firefighting is that it performed effectively, in their opinion. There is evidence of an incident at level 20. Very unfortunately, I just can't bring the time to my mind right now. It wasn't late in the fire, where the water pressure and flow rate at level 20 was less, if that's what you mean.
But that's the functioning of the dry riser is going to be related to the functioning of the fire brigade's pumping equipment.
Correct.
And the supply of water to that equipment.
Correct.
It's not going to be there's nothing intrinsic to the dry riser that you're aware of.
That's why I don't quite understand the question, because the dry riser is an empty pipe and it exists as an empty pipe in itself.
Well, you could have had a problem, for example, at a level where you couldn't get the cap off, or
I see.
Valve didn't work, or something like that.
Yes, I'm not aware of. I'm not aware that detailing of the physical infrastructure was a problem.
Yeah. This might help a little bit, but it's said that the dry riser did achieve the 10 bar pressure that you were referring earlier. Do you remember, between a comparison between the pressure that a wet riser, you said 15.5, and the dry riser 10 bar was the requirement. And it suggested that it did, when tested, achieve that 10 bar requirement. Have you considered that test evidence?
No, I have not.
No.
I'm not aware that it did.
But it would be appropriate for probably another inquiry expert to consider any testing of the dry riser that was done.
Yes, and how it's done, replicating the exact circumstances of the external firefighting and condition of the water network around the tower on that night particularly.
Yeah. Mr. Chairman, I have no more questions on that topic, and I'm about to move to a bigger topic, which is about the lift. So I think
would you like to break at that point?
I think that would be an appropriate moment for a break, and I would be happy to come back at 2.
Sure?
I'm sure.
Oh, there we are. Miss Grange thinks it's safe to have an extra 10 minutes for lunch. Right, we're going to break at that point then, and we will resume at 2 o'clock.
Okay.
So if you'd like to go with the usher,
Yeah,
and
thank you.
I have to remind you not to talk about your evidence. Good, thank you. Right, 2 o'clock then, please. Thank you.